The views expressed on the following program do not necessarily reflect the views of Money Radio staff, management, or advertisers, and do not represent an offer to buy or sell any securities. Some interviews heard on this program may be sponsored by the participants. It's time for Health Futures with Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth. This is Arizona's only show dedicated to providing you with expert advice on how to live a longer, healthier, and happier life. To learn more, call 602-264-8009. That's 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Bob Roth.
Good afternoon. You're listening to Health Futures, taking stock in you, and I'm your host, Bob Roth, and it must be Friday, and indeed it is. We're coming at you live from the Scottsdale Air Park Money Radio Studios, 1510 AM, 105.3 FM, and the World Wide Web, moneyradio1510.com. If this is the first time you've tuned into our show is about how our older adult population can live a healthier, happier life. How do they do that? They do that by listening right here. And it's not to me, it's to listen to our extraordinary guests that are here in the studio. Before I introduce our guests, I want to just give a big shout out. Today is National Caregivers Day, and we are honoring those individuals who are selfishly giving up their time and efforts to provide personal care, physical and emotional support to their loved ones, friends, neighbors, anybody that is needing assistance. And I've said this time and time again, if you know a caregiver out there that is making that ultimate sacrifice, please reach out to them. Tell them how much you appreciate them, but also offer to give them some assistance too. I know typically they say no, they've got it. So sometimes you don't have to offer, just do. And my standard is if you're making a casserole or meatloaf, make two and then deliver one to your friend, neighbor, family member, loved one, whoever that is making that sacrifice. So today, we honor those caregivers out there that are making that personal sacrifice. So thank you to all of you out there who are doing the hard work every single day. So getting back to our show, and it's about our guests. So today, I have a guest that has been on the show before. Let's calculate. That's 7 years ago. A little more than 7 years ago, January 22nd, Emily Taylor was on the show. And she was just a young buck back then, and now she's a seasoned veteran. And I can't believe it's been 7 years, so we won't wait another 7 years. But Emily Taylor is in the house. She's in the studio, and she's here with her business partner. And his name is Caleb Lihn, and the name of their firm is Taylor & Lihn, PLLC. They do legal work in the special needs area, elder law, and estate planning. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bob. Happy to be back.
Thank you so much. Good to see you again, and great to be on the show.
It's great to have you guys on the show. And, you know, I always try to do this when we have attorneys on the show, especially that specialize in your area, is really take this time to appeal to our listeners how we can avoid the expense, the agony, the emotional challenges you have when you don't have a plan. How can we get them to plan? And what am I talking about? I'm talking about planning for the inevitable. They talk about taxes and death. Those are the two guarantees that we have in life. And unfortunately, we're all not going to live forever. And for those that are needing a plan, you need to listen to these two individuals. So I want to really kick off to really talk about the need to really sit down and memorialize what your wishes are. So I'll punt it over to you.
Absolutely. You mentioned today's National Caregivers Day, and I think about the stress and pressure of those caregivers. And if we think about the person they're giving care to, and if they haven't taken the opportunity to plan, how an extra level of stress related to court, related to other family members, related to their questioning or doubting the decisions they're making. Care planning, estate planning is a gift to those caregivers. Caregiving in and of itself is such a difficult road to follow.
It is, and really so our listeners know 65-year-olds that are caring for one another. And this is a data point from AARP. 63% of the time, the caregiver predeceases the care recipient when they're not getting assistance. And you mentioned courts. And, you know, the thing that I think people don't really realize is if you don't have a plan in place, you end up in what is called probate court. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So a couple different steps along the way. We've got power of attorney documents. So both our advanced directives, our healthcare power of attorney, mental health care power of attorney, and living will, along with financial power of attorney, can help us provide a team to step in the event of incapacity, which is going to help us avoid guardianship and conservatorship. So ultimately, that process is held in the probate court. And then also, when we pass away, traditional probate procedures take place as it relates to the administration of a last will and testament, or somebody who has truly no plan in place, an intestate probate. So on a number of different levels, we're trying to stay out of court. If we've got the right people in place and the right paperwork in place, we can avoid a costly period of time.
No doubt. And the thing about it is really having this conversation. And certainly I'm appealing to our listeners. And you may not be that older adult, you may be that adult child, but you know, if your loved one doesn't have any plans in place, you need to really start thinking about that, right, Caleb?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to kind of connect on something you said, Bob, and kind of something that Emily just said, for a lot of people when they think about estate plan, it's just such an ambiguous, weird term. And I think people get intimidated by it and they don't really know what it means per se. And to Emily's point, she kind of described two parts in the process where there's really planning for your life while you're living if something happens to you, a medical event, an accident, some kind of unfortunate trauma, but also then secondarily planning for after your death and what happens to your things, that is, you know, your estate, what you own. And you don't have to have some kind of threshold or minimum amount of assets to make your estate worth planning for. It's what you've owned, it's what you've worked for, and so you should be planning for it. You deserve that. And so, as Emily said, there's putting together incapacity planning and death planning. And to your point, Bob, there's, you know, if you don't plan, a lot of what your desired outcome is, may not come to fruition. And a lot of the clients that come into our office are experiencing the passing of a loved one, and maybe there was no planning, or in some cases poor planning. It wasn't well thought out. Maybe they went online to try to do it. It just kind of got piecemealed. And so often we see this bad outcome that doesn't match what they wanted. And if they had just done the proper planning and got the proper advice ahead of time, that conversation, that negative or, hey, this isn't this, you know, this hard conversation we have to have with them, that could have in many cases been avoided. So I always tell people, like you said, death is one of the inevitables. We know it's going to happen. We know we're going to have to, through our lives, confront the passing of our loved ones, unfortunately, at some point. Mm-hmm. So to Emily's point, to the caregivers, let's extrapolate that out. Let's give gifts to our loved ones and make that passing is you know, I tell people, you want to be able to focus on the emotion and the grieving and not have to deal with all these sort of business decisions or having to go to court. So if we plan right, we're streamlining the unnecessary stuff what's necessary, but it's just streamlining the ability to focus on your grieving and make the legal stuff as easy as possible at that point.
You know, it's interesting to hear you say that, because we say the same thing in the caregiving space, right? So we provide in-home care supportive services to families, and we say to the family members, especially when someone's near the end of life, you need to be the daughter, you need to be the wife, you need to be the husband, you need to be in that. You don't need to be caregiving, because that is so stressful and so hard. And I get exactly what you're saying. I mean, they need to be not thinking about those things. They need to make those last and final moments matter. You know, the old cliche is, if you fail to plan, then you plan to fail. And it's so true, and never more true than in the work that you guys do. You hear the music. We're down one segment. We got 3 more to go. I want to take the beginning of the second segment, if you would allow me, to at least have you share with our listeners a little bit of background of yourself. I know you're a native here, and Emily, I don't know if you are.
Midwesterner.
Midwesterner. And then I want to have you just share real quickly how you guys came together to form Taylor and Lihn. You're listening to Health Futures Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth. I've got Emily Taylor and Caleb Lihn here in the studio. Stick around. We'll be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth. And if you're just tuning in, we're in our second segment. I've got the law firm of Taylor Lihn here in the studio. They specialize in special needs planning, elder law, and estate planning. If you want to reach them, just so you know, I'm giving them a plug here. The phone number is 480-699-3145, or you can reach them on the website at taylorlihn.com. And that's TAYLORLIHN.com. So when I ended the first segment, I appealed to both of these individuals to share a little bit about themselves. So, Emily, I'm going to look to you to tell us a little bit about you and who you are and how you came to practice law, and the same for you, Caleb, and I want to understand how you guys came together.
Absolutely. Well, I would say I never intended to be a lawyer, and in fact don't know exactly how that happened. But all of that said, when you kind of start to look at my past, it makes a little bit more sense. I was raised in the Midwest, as I mentioned, a small town, Galena, Illinois, which is a little bit famed for those who like to bed and breakfast and antique in the Midwest. And my father was a physical therapist, and my mom was a social worker, and ultimately a social worker with Hospice of the Valley. And so both of their careers and their involvement in our special needs community, my father was on the board of directors for a vocational workshop, and my mom was a lifelong Special Olympics coach. Now it makes perfect sense what I do, but I moved from the Midwest to attend ASU in the year 2000 and graduated from University of Arizona Law School in 2007, practiced law at a firm for about 6 years, and then went out on my own almost 8 years ago, or 8 or 9 years ago now.
Wow.
So yeah, it's been
And that's about the time I had you on. You were on your own.
Yep, exactly. So really appreciated you inviting us then and now.
Yes.
And really feel very fortunate with what I do day to day. I love my job.
I love that too. And just to kind of, segue for Caleb here, how'd you guys get connected?
So Caleb and I have been longtime colleagues. He, in his own journey and own path, started this area of law and elder law around the same time I did on my own. And so as somewhat solo practitioners, we would go to lunch and talk shop and then also call each other when we have tough situations or problems arise. And so we were good friends, and then we started both business coaching in a similar practice group. And so I'll let him tell the story of our fated lunch, but longtime friends before becoming business partners.
Yeah, and I don't know why I went to law school. I always wanted to be a lawyer as a kid, and it just sort of came to be. So I just followed this sort of foreclosed path, and like many law students, I came out during a time in the cycle of the legal world where jobs were sparse, and so I took a job in litigation, which was kind of where the path I was on for about eight or 9 years, and kind of towards the end of that 8 or 9 years, almost simultaneously, I had my wife and I found out that our younger daughter was going to be born with a severe medical complex issue, and we were going to have to travel across the country for care, and we did that, and she's doing very well. Everything went extremely well with that, but in that moment, as we're living in the hospital with her for a month or so, and I'm meeting other families and seeing the problems that they're experiencing with their, sick and struggling children. I'm like, this is, I'm a lawyer, but I don't know how to support my daughter with her needs and the
Right.
kinds of things that she's going to need. And I knew about this area, special needs planning, but I didn't know anything about it as a lawyer. And then sort of unfortuitously, about the same time as an only child, my mother had some dementia issues, and she was back in Arizona while I'm across the country. And I'm starting to navigate long-term care issues with her, and where is she going to live? How is she going to be taken care of? And I'm like, I don't know anything about this either. So I just started feeling really guilty that I'm a lawyer. I went to school to get this degree, and I don't know how to help my family on these things. And so that kind of for me was a pivot point to dedicate my career to helping people in these fields that we're talking about. And yeah, right about the same time that Emily started her firm, I had a partner and started my law firm and kind of moving my journey in this area. And then because of some other things there, we kind of decided to go our separate ways. And literally the day that I made that decision, Emily and I had lunch scheduled. And so I sit down late, kind of frazzled, and Emily says, "Well, you okay?" And I said, "Well, a little bit of a crisis where I'm leaving my partnership." And like 3 days later, we started talking about timing and the birth of Taylor and Lynn.
Oh, wonderful. I love that story. I really do. And I want to make sure our listeners understand this, because you talked about your family and how that really propelled you into this area of law. Special needs. If you would, for our listeners, what is special needs and what does that mean to our listeners?
Yeah, I mean and I'll let Emily jump in too, because it's such a big part of what we do. But special needs planning is really taking developmentally disabled or disabled individuals and planning for them. A lot of what we're trying to do in special needs planning is making sure that the proper caregivers are in place, the proper people with legal authority to make decisions are in place, that if special needs beneficiaries are on public benefits, many of which are means tested, meaning there's income or asset requirements associated with them, we want to make sure that inheritances or recoveries from a lawsuit or gifts from grandparents or those kinds of things don't jeopardize their benefits or their eligibility for those benefits. So it's sort of looking holistically at the life of a special needs beneficiary from a legal perspective and making sure things are in order. Would you say that's fair, Emily?
Absolutely. Yep. Big picture. I think, I tell people I practice special needs law, and they're not usually familiar with the term.
Right. That's why I wanted you to explain that.
And
Absolutely.
ask the same questions. And a lot of times with that explanation, people say, "Oh yeah, my cousin or my nephew." It tends to come up so often that within families and social structures, we run across individuals who have an autism diagnosis or some other sort of situation that's going to require some more comprehensive planning. And that's really, between the elder law and the special needs, there's so much overlap, because we're really just thinking about situations where we have to pay extra attention to different decisions and looking at a bigger picture or bigger scope. So absolutely.
And it's interesting, I know our listeners, and even when I think of special needs, you mentioned autistic children. I know that your firm and your mom, was connected to the Special Olympics, so, we often think about children, but there are adults too that, may have a traumatic brain injury or may have a diagnosis that requires them, I would think, to have a special needs trust put together or something like that, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And the other big change that's happened in the last couple decades is that science has caught up to many of the things that used to take these people from us prematurely. So when we had shorter life expectancy, planning was often forgotten because they anticipated or expected that their loved child wouldn't survive them. And so with all this medical advances,
Sure.
we've got a lot of children needing to be planned for who are now adults and, in fact, elderly and all
Right.
sorts of awesome things that we really need to consider and plan for.
Breakthroughs in science. I mean, you think about, Down's children, you think about Down syndrome children, you also think about cystic fibrosis children. I mean, they didn't live long lives 25 years ago, and they're living a lot longer thanks to science.
Exactly. Yep.
Now we're seeing families, and Emily and I have had this discussion. We're seeing families where there's a special needs child who's no longer a child. They're aging and they're becoming close to elderly, and you've got real elderly parents who are starting to struggle with, who's going to care for my child when we're gone? And I have a couple clients now that they're in their 70s and they have children who are adults who need full-time care,
and they're in their 50s.
Yeah, and they're in their 50s, and they've dedicated their lives to this children. And I've sat with them as they're sobbing and thinking, nobody's going to care for our daughter like we do. What the heck do we do?
Right.
And so, part of our job is to sit there and help them, give them the options and tell them what the landscape will look like and help them plan.
Now, I really appreciate you walking us through that. We're now really close to approaching halftime here. So, I wanted to get that out of the way because it's so important. Like you said, Emily, so many people don't know what special needs law is. And, now our listeners do. I have a better understanding of it, and it's certainly a big part of your practice. But when we come back, I want to really delve into more of the memorializing, estate planning, some of the things that you're seeing out there, and certainly the memorializing piece. I want to just kind of give a tease before our third segment after halftime, and that is a lot of people, are relying on technology and the internet, and obviously there are websites you can go to. But there's nothing like sitting down with somebody that is a professional that can give you advice. So you can make, and you can probably share with us some of the mistakes people have made by finding these documents and just filling them out and not having them correct. You're listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth. I've got the Taylor Lihn Law Group here. We're at halftime. Stick around. We'll be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth, and we are in our second half here, our third segment, and I have got the law firm of Taylor Lihn here in the studio. They specialize in special needs planning, elder law, and estate planning law as well. The two principals of the firm are Emily Taylor and Caleb Lihn. And if you missed the first half, go up to our website at cypresshomecare.com. Click on the media button. The button right below is radio show. You'll catch this one and about 500 others we've been bringing to you for the last 10 years. I know, Emily, can you believe it, 10 years? It's been 7 years since I had you on the show, but I really love what we're talking about. And, if you missed that first half, the first segment was really talking about putting your affairs in order, memorializing your wishes. The second half was really getting a chance to get to know both of you guys a lot better. But when I ended that second segment, I talked about the fact that, we have technology now and people going out to the internet and they're filling out all these forms so they can avoid having to pay for a lawyer. So, Caleb, you or Emily, I know you have stories about people that went that route and it kind of took a left turn and didn't go as well as they really had intended. And they just spent a little bit of money. These lawyers don't charge that much money. Trust me, they don't. And it's worth the amount of money to spend because you will have exactly what you're looking for rather than some broad-based, boilerplate. I know lawyers hate hearing that type form. But, please, if you can indulge me and our listeners to really talk about the need to really sit down with a law firm to have these discussions.
Bob, if we had the time, we could spend all 4 segments talking about mistakes that are made through online services or somebody trying to grab a form off the internet. There's a lot of different legal companies that promise to do your estate planning online. They will, for a fee, they will give you a one-size-fits-all approach. I've talked to probably a dozen families who've had a loved one do a trust through one of those online legal providers. That person passed away, and I've got family members that in my office, I'm meeting them for the first time, and they're like, oh, my aunt, my grandma, my father, so-and-so did this trust on this website. Every single time the trust has not been funded. When we talk about funding a trust, we mean the trust owns your assets, your home, your bank accounts, etc. So the trust owns nothing. In all of those cases, they wasted their money. They have a useless piece of paper. They don't have an estate plan. They've got copy paper with
Right.
words on it.
Right.
And so I have to tell these families, like, this is really crappy, but what your loved one was trying to do and probably avoid probate and put together this nice plan, that's not happening. You're going to have to go through probate because all of this stuff's not going into this trust they created that was a one-size-fits-all anyway. I have a client right now who did a power of attorney for her father who was diagnosed with dementia from an online form. She filled it out wrong, and now she's having to go through conservatorship because the power of attorney can't be honored because she used the form and didn't fill out right. And the fees to do the guardianship, the time that takes, exceeds what it would have done to just do the plan right.
And not just the fees. How about the aggravation?
The
And the
stress.
emotional stress. I mean, you can't put a price tag on that. I mean, you're grieving. You've lost someone you loved, and you thought you had your affairs in order, and guess what? You didn't. No, that's tragic.
Yeah, I'll say, you know, I do a lot less litigation in the office, so I'm not necessarily working with fighting families, but a lot of times when I'm trying to help a family implement a plan that's in place, or perhaps they've seen an estate planning service before, a lot of the wishes they've memorialized were not thought all the way through. And one of my favorite things is to watch eye contact between myself and the clients and between spouses. And when I ask questions, I can pick up on pieces that we need to talk about further. And so my fear and my experience has been that with a lot of the online document preparation, or working with a document preparer who may not fully understand every piece of it, we miss a lot of the nuanced conversations that need to happen. We tend to allow our ability to deny that things may or may not be true. You know, my favorite question is, well, how well do your children get along? And I don't really need to hear the answer. I know in the first 5 seconds if they're being honest with me. And one of the things I've heard recently that I love to repeat is that when you pass away and your children have to come together, for better or worse, however they get along now, they're going to behave like they're in grade school on Saturday morning having to pick out one cereal and one cartoon. And it's just not going to go as well as you planned. But the conversations that you have with families in the process result in a more valuable plan because we've really thought through a lot of the different pieces that I think get missed when you're just saying yes or no, A or B on a form online.
Well, just to shine a quick light on that too, I think the value or one of the huge values of an attorney versus an online service is, if I didn't go to law school, if I didn't practice in this area, I could go on TurboTax and check some boxes, but I don't know what deductions I'm missing or not. And so when meeting with an attorney, you're getting that counseling, that experience, that conversation. And like Emily said, you're asking questions about the family and the dynamics and their desires. And that allows you to factor all that into a plan and making decisions and designing a plan that fit that. None of that's going to happen, likely, if you're working through some online form or through some online service.
No doubt. They still have cartoons on Saturday morning?
I think so. I still eat cereal, so.
No, there you go. No, but I want to pick up on what you talked about, and both of you have talked about, and the importance of family meetings. And certainly, you know, why is it important to have these meetings? But more importantly, you know, you probably get phone calls from a lot of adult children who want you to sit down with their mom and dad. I want you to explain to me and our listeners, you know, the conversation you have about who's the client and who's not the client, and really, you know, why are these meetings so important?
Absolutely. So kind of like you said, a lot of times generationally, we see different responses to the estate planning conversation. So we have generations that have perhaps done some planning but are hesitant to share about assets or wishes. And so a lot of times we'll experience a loss and we're surprised by what's in the documents, or perhaps it's not as clear as they had hoped. And so there's an opportunity where if we could go back in time, we might be able to clarify some of that. And so the other piece with this is that generationally too, as I'm doing planning for younger families or families at any ages, we have an opportunity now as we're doing a new plan to invite the people who will participate in the implementation of the plan to the conversation as well. So on both ends, the concept of talking about things is in some cases new and sometimes scary, but the reality is death and taxes are going to happen, so we're going to have this conversation. It's just whether or not the most important people will be a part of the conversation. So one of the few benefits of perhaps our time during COVID is the ability to Zoom. So I'm having a lot more family meetings with adult children all over the country. We've completed a plan with their parents, and they want to share what they've put in place. They want to talk about the answers they provided on their living will and what that means for them. In terms of the client relationship, we have to be very clear about that. And so from the beginning, we're talking about concepts of confidentiality and ethics and duty and all of that. But I think if the family circumstances are right and whoever my client is feels comfortable sharing, that really can open up the power of these documents and turn it into something that happens. And as I mentioned, I grew up in the Midwest, and my grandfather was a farmer. And one of the things he taught me is that every year we would have a farm meeting, quote unquote farm meeting, because he had a farm. And as young children, we were invited to the conversation to learn about what fertilizer cost and who the new accountant was and all these things. And my grandpa's been gone for a while now, but we still have farm meetings every year. So I encourage that with my clients because I can see how that really inspires other family members and broadens the conversation and the valuableness of the documents.
Does Grandpa still have the farm, or is that
No.
just a terminology to bring the family together?
Just,
It's got the
just
legacy lives.
terminology now.
There you
Yeah,
go.
yeah. Nobody else had quite the skills to grow that corn and soybeans.
There you go. Well, we're down 3 segments. We got another one coming up, and I really want to talk about all right, we get all these documents. What do we do now? Where do we store them? How do we make them available to other people? And then, I want to really talk about, reflecting on the values that you want to capture in your estate planning. And certainly, the Special Olympics is something that is near and dear to your family, your professional family, and your personal family, Emily. And I know a lot of people want to be charitable with their giving, and I want to talk a little bit about that as well. Get a little Marshall Tucker Band taking us out here, so thank you, James. You're listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth, and I've got the Taylor Lihn Law Firm here in the studio. We're down 3 segments. We got 1 more to go. We'll be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth, and we are in our 4th segment here. I've got the Taylor Lihn Law Firm here in the studio. They specialize in special needs planning, elder law, and estate planning. And if you want to reach them, you can reach them at 480-699-3145 or go out to their website at taylorlihn.com. That's TAYLORLIHN.com. And if you missed the first 3 segments, you can catch them up on our website at cypresshomecare.com. Click on the media button. Right below it is our radio show. You can catch this show and many, many more. So we talked about in our last segment, we talked about families and the importance of having family meetings. We talked about in the first segment, we talked about memorializing your documents and making sure you have all your documents filled out, completed to your wishes. We did talk in the last segment about avoiding the internet documents and making sure you have a professional that can help you memorialize truly what you're intending to do. But lastly, I want to talk about, what do you do once you do these, Emily and Caleb? You have your documents. Where do you go from there?
Anytime we complete an estate plan with somebody, our practice in the office is to provide them back with their original documentation. We also give them a photocopy, of course, as well as a digital copy in a number of secure ways. But we also have a conversation, and we talk to them about perhaps who they feel comfortable sharing this plan with. That includes their professional team, so their advisors, their accountants, the people they've named in the documents, and depending on family dynamics, perhaps other family members or people who might ultimately be beneficiaries. We also encourage folks to register their healthcare directives through the Arizona Secretary of State Registry Program. And we also provide families or clients with cards that say, attention, we've done important legal documents. Please try to find them. It's a little nicer than that, but a card they can carry with them so that in the event there's an emergency or a situation, people trying to help them out can find out where those plans might be. And ultimately, we're going to keep a copy of their documents as well, but it's mostly that conversation and making sure that they're sharing with the people who will need to step in and who will know what's going to happen, having access to what we've done.
It used to be years ago there'd be a will registry in the county that they'd maintain, and you'd file your will there, and that's those days are long gone.
Right.
And so a lot of people will say, well, I don't know where the trust is filed, or I don't know where the will's filed. And I said, well, hopefully it's filed in your house, because that's where you're going to keep it, at a house. Maybe some people keep it in the safe deposit box, but generally keeping, and that's why, kind of dovetailing from the last segment, that's why the family meetings are so important too, to kind of bridge that gap from the people who've created the plan to their loved ones, the next generation, and saying, hey, we're going to show this to you. Or maybe they're more of a private family and they're just going to say, hey, kids, we've done this plan. It's in the home office. When the time comes, you'll know where to find it. So it's a lot of that's family dynamics and personal, but communicating they've done the plan, where it's at, where it can be found, and it goes a long way when that person then or family becomes, hopefully not for a while, but if they face an incapacity or a death, then it just kind of helps make that process smoother. Going back to what we talked about earlier, where they can put more of their energy on the grieving and the emotion of the situation, and hope that the planning kind of just is a little more seamless and carries that through.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, and you certainly, I would imagine it happens more times than not. People that are named in documents don't see that until the time happens. And how what's the importance level on that? I mean, do you really encourage, or are you just okay with that not happening? You know what I mean? Because it's like, surprise.
Well, I think
you're in charge. You didn't know that.
We hear both ends. Some people will say, I have to ask and make sure they're willing to do it. And I can say, well, you can nominate them. They can decide later. But yes, I do actually encourage the conversations and the sharing, especially with the team, right? And sometimes that team is your family, and sometimes it's not. Perhaps they've interviewed and nominated professional trustees or fiduciaries. And so sharing with them is equally important. The other piece is that our legal plan is that a legal plan. There still needs to be a logistical plan. And so we also have conversations and encourage that. We have books in our office called I'm Dead, Now What? We have a peace of mind planner. Because in addition to the legal documents, your loved ones or your decision makers are going to need to know where your bank accounts are, where the key to your safe deposit box is, who they need to call, what you want done. So there's so much more to it in addition to the legal documents. But yes, the short answer is I do encourage.
I think I might need that book for my mother-in-law. I'm Dead, Now What? There you go. No. So I want to conclude and really share with you, or have you share with us, blended families, because I'm dealing with a situation right now where I have a husband and wife, and they have a very nice estate and they're taken care of, but I have two daughters that are really connected to daddy, and they're making decisions for their stepmother, but the son's not involved in that. And you probably see a lot of the stuff that happens with blended families, and they can get very complicated.
Blended families have to consider an estate plan. Like, it's not a luxury. That things will go bad in a blend. We get calls probably once every 2 weeks from a child of a deceased parent who was remarried and says, my stepmom or my stepdad rewrote their plan and I'm out of it now. And a lot of the times that's legal. Whether it's appropriate morally or not, that's not my decision. But it happens all the time. And so blended families really have to prepare, because they're some formation of the Brady Bunch crew, and they need to get their affairs in order and decide what's going to happen when one of us passes, and are we going to make sure that both of our sets of children are protected no matter what, and avoiding that situation if they don't want that their new spouse is going to write their kids out, because that's awful when somebody's dad or mom passes and they get nothing from it. They don't even, I've had families fighting just to get photos because stepmom or stepdad has kind of manipulated things and changed things. So getting a plan in place for blended families is even more important than it is for.
I think it's so appropriate that we talk about this at the end. So our listeners can really understand this. And with my case, it happens to be really the healthcare, where the step daughters are actually making decisions for the stepmother, and the son's not really involved, and he does have power of attorney, but they're making decisions. So I have a couple of really good employees, so they're really pushing that. Look, we need to include everybody. And by the way, I need to see your powers. Can you send me the document so I have that?
Right. So
we do need to see those things, and I think we today see more blended families than we ever have in the past.
Absolutely.
It can be a beautiful thing, but it also can be equally trying. So in either case, I think the right people need to be in there, and that needs to be thought through intelligently and mindfully.
So we have about 30 seconds. Any last thoughts you want to leave with our listeners? Any question I didn't ask that you would like to really cover?
It's all very important, and we appreciate you having us on today.
Yeah, pleasure to be here, Bob. Thanks so much.
Well, listen, I can't thank you enough. I've known Emily for at least 7 years, and Caleb, it's really good to get to know you as well.
Likewise, thank you.
And I really appreciate the work you do. It's not easy work, but it's so important. It really is. It's important for the families out there that you are working with. So my hat's off to you. Make it a great day. Have a great weekend. We'll be back next Friday. Caleb and Emily, thank you for joining me here on Health Futures.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's no place like home. You've been listening to Bob Roth's Health Futures. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call Cypress Home Care Solutions at 602-264-8009. That's 602-264-8009. Or visit cypresshomecare.com. Be sure to join Health Futures with Bob Roth every Friday at noon, right here on Money Radio 1510 and 105.3 FM.